Now it's my pleasure to formally introduce our moderator and our guest speaker. Phyllis Lockett is founder and CEO of Leap Innovations, which provides districts and schools the foundational tools, strategies, and support to make a shift to a personalized learning model. Leap enables new learning environments for children regardless of race, culture, or socioeconomics. In the last 6 years, Leap has served nearly 40,000 students, 90% of whom are children of color. Phyllis is also a driving force behind Chicago's charter school movement and was the founding president and CEO of New Schools for Chicago. Phyllis, thank you for joining us as today's moderator. Now, let me introduce our keynote speaker today, Sal Khan. This moment in time illustrates just how prescient Sal's vision for Khan Academy was when he founded the organization in 2008. An educational nonprofit, Khan Academy offers free online lessons in math, science, and humanities to 20 million monthly users in 190 countries and are delivered in multiple languages. Since the onset of the pandemic, however, Khan Academy has become an essential learning tool for teachers, students, and parents who are all struggling with virtual learning. Khan Academy's study minutes have tripled, its teacher-student registrations are up 300%, and parent registrations are up more than 1,000%. This school year alone, CPS students have logged 10.5 million Khan Academy minutes. Sal, welcome to the Economic Club of Chicago, and Phyllis, I now turn things over to you.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here, and Sal, it's wonderful to be with you tonight. We're just so excited about the tremendous impact Sal Khan Academy has had on the world, and to get a part of that with you in Chicago tonight is just wonderful. You've told the origin story of Khan Academy many times and in many venues, but tell us a little bit about the Sal Khan before Khan Academy and how your experience growing up as a kid in Louisiana shaped your vision.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. Um, yeah, I was born and raised in actually Metairie, Louisiana, which is, if you ever go to New Orleans, it's between the airport and New Orleans. You drive through Metairie. That's where I was born and raised. And I had kind of in some ways, a normal upbringing. My anyone who's familiar with U.S. immigration policy. In 1965, you had the Immigration Act, which frankly allowed immigration from non-European countries. So that's where you have the first influx of people from South Asia and other places. And my father came in 1968 as a medical resident at LSU New Orleans. And there was also a shortage of healthcare workers at the time. So there's kind of an influx of people associated with healthcare. Went back to, by this point, Bangladesh had gotten separated from Pakistan. Marries my mom in an arranged marriage, comes back to New Orleans. My sister's born in 73. I was born in 76. My family ends up my parents end up separating. I never really got to meet my father. So my mom raised us as a single mother. And, I went to kind of a Louisiana, public school system. And, to your question about informing the vision of Khan Academy, what I saw in my own kind of academic progression is a lot of my friends who could beat me at chess, could learn how to solve a puzzle far faster than I could. All of a sudden I would see they're failing an algebra class, or they're failing a trigonometry class or physics class. And when they're struggling and you're not, or you seem to doing fine, there's kind of two different models you can have in your head. You could just say, oh, maybe I'm just special. I have a gift for algebra. Or you could say there's something weird going on in the system, because there's a lot of other areas where this person can eat my lunch. And even as an observer of what was going on, or fairly young, I realized that a lot of my friends were having trouble because they had gaps in their knowledge. They were getting a B or 80% on one concept that and there was no, in a traditional system, there's no mechanism to fill in that gap. Then the whole class moves on to the next concept, usually building on those gaps, no way to fill that in. And that's why eventually people are hitting walls. And so in high school, I was actually, probably no surprise to folks, I was the president of the math club. and, and, uh, and I was also on the wrestling team, but the only wrestling trophy I ever got was highest GPA on the wrestling team. But the you know, when in the math club, it was actually a pretty legit math club where, in order for any student who was struggling in math, anyone I think getting below a B, they were required to attend our tutoring that we ran. The school enforced this. And what we saw is that when my peers, a lot of them who thought they were no good at math, who were failing, who were getting C's, had an opportunity to get personalized attention, fill in their gaps. Not only did some of these kids start becoming A students, a lot of these kids joined the math club. And these are like not the kids that you think of. Exactly. It's a pipeline. And so that was always in the back of my mind. And I just saw that pattern over and over again. When I went to college, a lot of kids struggling. It was because of gaps. You give them personalized instruction, they're able to fill that in. When I started tutoring my cousins in 2004, my day job was an analyst at a hedge fund, saw the pattern again. And so the roots of Khan Academy really are, can we create tools to help people learn at their own time and pace, fill in those gaps, help teachers also help their students fill in their gaps and learn at their own time and pace.
No, that's awesome. And talk a little bit about that because, this is the Chicago Economic Club. You look at your resume, your computer science degree, MIT, MBA from Harvard, working at a hedge fund to tutoring family members and opening up a nonprofit with no money. Like, did people think you were nuts? And like, what did your mom say?
Gee, it's a little bit of a touchy subject. It's a little bit of, there's some revisionist history, but who knows? I don't know if I'm the one that's revising or other people are the ones that are revising. No, when I was doing this as a hobby, a lot of people thought it was interesting. And, as you mentioned, it was 2004 that I started tutoring cousins. I was a year out of business school. I was an analyst at a hedge fund, and I was doing that for many years. And then I started making software for them, and that was the first Khan Academy. Then a friend suggested that I make videos to supplement the software, and then that became kind of the source of the video component of Khan Academy. And as it grew, and by 2009, I was getting letters from folks all over the world saying how I was helping them. I was frankly having trouble focusing on my day job. And, so my wife and I both agree that it felt like there was something special here. And so we looked at at the time, our finances. We were saving some money to buy a house, which is not an easy proposition out here in Northern California, but we figured we could probably live off of that savings. She was a medical resident, so she was making a little bit of money, but for the most part, we would have to dig into our savings. Our first child had just been born. For about a year to give this a shot. And, I remember when I quit my job, I got a lot of family members calling me up, what have you just done? What are you doing to your career? And it's a hard thing to do. In Silicon Valley, if I was quitting my job to do a venture-backed startup, even though that is also a very risky thing to do, people understand what that is. And so it's easier to explain that at a cocktail party. But when you say you quit your job and what are you doing? You're starting a not-for-profit that makes online resources for free for people. There's the YouTube component. At that time, doing stuff on YouTube did not have the same legitimacy as it does today. Then there's the software component, and part of the reason why people looked at me like I was crazy is because the mission, which I used to articulate back then as a one-man shop, was to provide a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere, which I think made people think I was even more delusional than, the fact that I'd quit my job with, a newborn at home, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that time was tough. And whenever you quit your job, it takes longer than you expect for people to be aligned that this is a project worth funding. So that was I laugh about it now, but that was a very stressful year.
It's such a courageous decision and a selfless act, right? To leverage the construct of what was driving your passion and to step out, right, and do it. It's extraordinary. And there are a lot of kids out there that are listening and with their parents tonight because you're such a rock star. What's extraordinary when I think about how you started is that there was no Zoom, there was no Google Classroom. Like you were doing this on Yahoo Doodle and using your mouse, right, to write math equations. It's pretty incredible.
Well, look, and I'm thank you for those very kind comments, but there was a selfish component of this for me too. Is that frankly I just really enjoyed it. It was a way for me to connect with family members. I think we all seek that human connection. It was a way that I was just feeling valuable. When people, it's funny, my day job I was an analyst at a hedge fund, and you can people will oftentimes respect you when you're an analyst at a hedge fund. You're like, oh, he's an analyst at a hedge fund, he's probably making some good money. But whenever people ask me, so but what's your impact on society? I'm like, well, markets need to be efficient and price discovery. It was a little bit of a roundabout answer. I have an answer, but it was a little bit more of a roundabout answer. So this made me feel I was also having another outlet. And even today, I'm as cool as I appear, I'm a geek at heart. And I love geeking out on all of this, and to be able to have a job where I can learn new things and really immerse myself and communicate it, and then connect with people who are able to benefit from it. I think that's the best that's the best job on the planet. And so yeah, no one should treat me like I'm somebody who gave up a lot.
No, it's awesome. Well, I know it wasn't easy. I've heard some of the stories, like it wasn't easy to kind of step out that way and to get this totally geared up. But we're so glad, the world is actually, that you persevered and you plowed ahead. So, you've built Khan Academy now, 30 million users a month, 46 languages across 190 countries. I mean, that's a long way from, doing this in your closet, right? So, there's a lot of talk about essential workers.
I'm laughing because I'm actually in the same closet where Khan Academy started. So I'm still doing it from the I'm still doing it from the closet.
Back into the same closet. Okay.
Yeah, it's cool.
That's great. Well, honestly, Khan Academy has become an essential tool, right? To so many students, teachers, parents, even during this time frame. So how did you pivot so quickly during this huge wave, and how are you continuing to answer the demand as that continues to increase during this time?
Yeah, well, even pre-COVID, as I was just talking about, our focus at Khan Academy has always been, it should never be technology for technology's sake. I'm the first to say, if I ever had to pick between amazing teacher and amazing technology, I'd pick the amazing teacher every time. So it should always be technology in service to some pedagogical goal, in service to, I would argue, more human to human connection, not less. And so well before COVID, we've been, preaching and building the tools for personalization, where people can learn at their own time and pace, mastery learning, where if you get an 80%, you get a 70% on your first go. You shouldn't just be branded with a C or a D on your forehead that goes in a permanent transcript, which all too often happens today. It should just be, that's where you are now. Keep working on it. But to keep working on it, you need to be able to have multiple places to practice and get assessment. And there's a lot of evidence that accelerates people's learning dramatically. It's just very hard to do logistically without technology. So that's where Khan Academy was always focused. Then there's also a component of a lot of kids around the world, not just kids, learners around the world, just don't have access to world-class resources. Their school might nominally teach a course, but it's really not that rigorous or that well done. Or you might be in a rural village in India where there's no one within 20 miles who could teach you algebra or calculus or physics. So that's always been the goal of Khan Academy. And then we actually first caught wind that we were going to be relevant to this whole COVID thing last February, which now feels like a lifetime ago. Got a letter. We saw our traffic start to pick up in Asia, and I got a letter from a teacher in South Korea saying how Khan Academy was how he was keeping his kids learning during their nationwide school closures. And I was like, that is wild, that an entire country has shut down its schools because of this COVID thing. And then obviously we know what happened. A few weeks later, the US was talking about the same thing. By mid-March, the same thing had happened, not in the US, not only the US, but around the world. 1 billion kids were out of school, at least physically. And, when we saw that coming, we realized it's, one of those moments where you kind of look left and you look right and you're like, I think this is us, where people are going to need something that's accessible, could work in a classroom context, has teacher tools, but also work in kind of a direct to family, direct to student context, things that can cover multiple subjects and grades. It has efficacy data behind it. And so that's where we started working with our engineering team, and they really deserve the credit. Myself and other leaders were like, are we good if we got our traffic at 200, 300%? They came back and said, yeah, we're good. I'm like, okay, good. And then we started creating, training programs. We knew that parents and teachers would need structures that they could anchor on what should a day look like in this new type of hybrid or homeschooling, whatever you want to call it. And then, when the schools closed, as it was introduced, our traffic became about 300% of normal. We normally see about 30 million learning minutes per day. We saw that go to about 85 or 90 million learning minutes per day on Khan Academy. And, as soon as it became clear that this was not a temporary thing, back then people were saying, maybe this is just through spring break, but it's pretty clear it's going to go through the end of the school year, the summer, maybe the next school year, which it clearly is now going through. We started putting out lesson plans, learning plans. We created these things called Get Ready for Grade Level courses, which allow teachers to assess how ready students are for grade level and for them to be able to fill in all of their gaps, and also students and parents to do it on their own. Spawned up a new not-for-profit because Khan Academy people were leaning on for the asynchronous, where they could get as much practice and feedback and the teachers could monitor it. But there was a huge gap in person-to-person connection over at least video conference. And so this new not-for-profit, schoolhouse.world, very complimentary. It's a place for students to get free tutoring
Tutoring,
on
that was thing.
but from vetted tutors, group tutoring sessions. And then that's also evolved into ways for even students to be able to signal their capabilities for things like college admissions. And incidentally, we're working very closely with the University of Chicago on that.
Oh, that's so terrific. That is great. And we all know the research with one-to-one tutoring, right? Targeted tutoring can make a dramatic impact on student achievement. So that's absolutely terrific. The pivot, the leverage, and just being in the right place at the right time. So I know that obviously we've been all talking about the concern around learning loss, right? MAP or NWEA assessment, which is what our Chicago Public Schools uses here, is estimating a third of a year of loss of reading and half a year in math. We know there's going to be even greater impact among low-income, rural and communities of color. I mean, what do you think we can do to stem this dangerous tide?
Yeah, and unfortunately, the data's, we're very close partners with NWA, and the data's probably even worse than because what they just reported, the loss on reading, but even more on the math side, that's of the kids that they were able to assess. So that's based on the kids that actually are actually engaged right now. But we know the reality, there's about 10 or 15% of kids who are actually just fallen out of the system right now. And so
Yeah.
they too suspect that those numbers would have been worse if those kids were even accessible right now. So it's a very, very serious thing. And, just as in the economy, people talking about a K-shaped recovery, that, those of us who are lucky enough to work in, white collar jobs, tech work, we're able to work distributed. We're doing just fine. In some cases, some of these businesses are doing better, but most of the country is suffering because of COVID. I think something very similar is happening on the education, where it's been suboptimal for everyone, just from a mental health, social, emotional point of view. But the middle income kids, upper middle class, affluent kids, all the data suggests this, and it's also anecdotal, but they're learning just fine. They're continuing to progress. In some cases, they might be learning better because parents are more engaged than they were before, and they're able to put together kind of puzzle pieces that are better at serving their kids' individual needs. So my view is, there's a period between now and next summer where we're going to be in this COVID strangeness. As much as possible, if either schools can do it or even families taking control themselves, leverage Khan Academy, leverage schoolhouse.world, leverage other resources to make sure that kids have the opportunity, the incentive to fill in those gaps and learn at their own pace, so that when we get back to normalcy, not only are they where they would have been, but maybe even they're ahead of where they normally would have been. We know some people will do that. We know other folks are already disengaged. So when they do come back in summer, having been disengaged for a year, they're going to need a lot of help. And I do view that we have to view this as like a disaster recovery project. You're going to have 10, 15, 20% of the population substantively behind. And it's not like things were rosy beforehand. I always cite the very depressing stat that 70% of all kids who go to community college have to take remedial math. Remedial math at community college is not 11th grade math. You go to the college and they're saying you're not even ready to learn algebra yet. So they have to go back to 6th or 7th grade math, which tells you that in a traditional system, kids are just pushed ahead. It gets watered down so they can kind of skate by, but at some point they're not really learning a lot. They get to the college system, first time they're enforcing mastery, and they're saying, you don't really know your material. Now it's going to be even worse. And those numbers, the Cal State four-year college system, 65%. And we see similar numbers on the reading comprehension side. So I'm hoping that when we get back to school, we lean even more heavily on on tools that can fill in the gaps, tutoring, things like schoolhouse.world, which is free. And actually the irony is we have so many great tutors. We can take on tens of thousands of students right now. So anyone listening, you want your kids to have free tutoring, come on board. Same thing on the Khan Academy side. We're ready to, support people through this, not just on the side where we can kind of be a supplemental resource, but also on the practice side, and increasingly also on the helping teachers have confidence that the teacher, what the students know and what they don't know, and where they might need more help.
Yeah, I think we've been talking a lot about this, that between the online resources of tutoring and the local community resources of tutoring, we actually can create a construct where every kid can get a tutor. Every kid can get access to their targeted needs. And how extraordinary would that be, right? I know one of the stats that hangs out in my mind is, McKinsey, the pre-COVID, right? Their estimate on the GDP loss driven by the achievement gap. It's about 173 billion to, $200 billion. Is awful. I mean, that exacerbated, right, through this process is something we're all going to have to contend with. And it's really illuminating the challenges and the disparity, if you will, or inequities that are in our system. And I know our own Janice Jackson, Dr. Janice Jackson, who's our superintendent, did a wonderful piece in the Washington Post today talking about the Marshall Plan. That we need a Marshall Plan in education, which is really real. And I wonder, how do you see that? Like, how do you see us leveraging the challenges and the strife at this time to define a new construct for what education needs to look like on the other side of this?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things that COVID's put a big spotlight on that are suboptimal now. We've talked about some of them. Another very notable one is obviously the digital divide. A lot of kids just can't engage right now because they don't have sufficient access. The silver lining is there's a spotlight on it now, and there's more energy than ever to solve some of these. I've been talking to people in government circles and philanthropic circles, and there seems to be increasing alignment, and this is bipartisan, on what needs to be done. We need to close the digital divide. I would be shocked if some of the next rounds of stimulus don't put several tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to essentially solve that. And it won't be solved overnight, but I think it can be solved over the next few years. So that needs to happen. That's kind of a baseline thing. The other thing that people are talking about a lot are kind of a competency-based credentialing and learning system. And competency-based, the best way to explain it is to contrast it with a seat time based. The system that most of us grew up in and the system that exists today is primarily seat time. You sit in a chair, you do what you're told, even if you don't know the material. If you can kind of skate by with a C, and then you're promoted to the next class. And usually it has to get even more watered down because you have all of those gaps from before, but you kind of do what you're told, and eventually you get a high school diploma, or even eventually you get a college diploma. The other model, and we know that increasingly some of those diplomas, as employers or even higher education, we're like, we don't know exactly whether you know the material or not. Here's another test so that we can verify whether you know it. Competency-based goes the other way. Here's some benchmarks that you need to show your mastery or your competency. If you take the assessment, whatever it is, and you're not there, not a big deal. We're not going to label you as not capable or dumb or anything like that. You're going to just need to practice some more, prepare some more, and then come back and take it again. And we're less concerned with how much time it took you or the path it took you. So some people, it might take 2 years to get to competency in algebra. Some people, it might take 2 weeks. Some people might need to do it through traditional means, sitting in a traditional class, maybe supplemented with Khan Academy. Maybe other people can do it with schoolhouse.world, this tutoring platform, and and a MOOC or some other type of tool. And so there's a lot of consensus that we need to have at least a competency-based pathway. And the reason why it's really important coming out of COVID, with so many people kind of being knocked around in the system, falling in, falling out, you have to provide a mechanism where, one, people can fill in their gaps so they can go back in the system, and they can show that they know their knowledge, regardless of if they kind of fell out of the system for whatever reason the first time. So there's a lot of energy around competency-based learning, a lot of energy, and it's kind of a corollary around personalization. And that's where there's a lot of energy around, we need to create a national tutoring core. And that has two sides to it, an economic side and an academic side. We're hoping that schoolhouse.world can really act as the platform where a lot of other tutoring groups can leverage to be able to scale tutoring, not just to thousands, but to millions of folks. And then there's the other side where people are talking, we have to put a lot of people to work. One of the most obvious places to put people to work is as tutors. So I think that's another interesting area that a lot of people are talking about right now, that, we could imagine a future where there is a national free tutoring platform. That I actually just this morning spoke to the folks in UK who are very involved with that. There's no reason why we can't replicate that, and actually even leapfrog what they did here in the US. I think we're going to a world where learning fundamentally is not going to be bound by time or space, and that's all related to the competency-based learning, the personalized learning tools. And I think some of the capacity that schools have created during COVID around hybrid capability, almost every school in the country now has a capability for a teacher to teach in the classroom, but a few kids can still participate from home. I hope we don't lose that capacity, because that's going to open up all sorts of possibilities around, let's say you want to take a class that's not offered in your high school. It could be offered by another high school on the other side of Chicago, or on the other side of the country, or on the other side of the world. And then schools don't just have to think about their building. They could think about, how do they contribute to the whole district, or how do they contribute to a broader, global learning community even.
I love everything you're describing, and when I hear this desire to go back to the way things were, I think that would be the opposite actually of what we need to do. We need to be leveraging all the learnings of what has happened over the last several months to see how do we pivot this so we can create more equity. This access of what we've not been able to do before COVID to give to every student it just opens the door to so many possibilities and opportunities. It's going to be exciting to see how we leverage that on the other side of this. And speaking of which, and I get this question a lot, just around the role of technology in education, because again, nothing replaces an excellent teacher in terms of what you just said. But what's your perspective on the role technology can play to enable more equity and opportunity for our students?
Yeah, and as agree 100% what you just said. And what's paramount is nothing can replace an excellent teacher, or a very good teacher, or a really solid teacher. We know there's certain parts of the world where there is no teacher, or the teacher could use some help. And so there, once again, it should never be technology for technology's sake, but technology can help raise the floor so that at least kids have access to something that is at a very high quality level. But in the ideal case, they do have access to a good or a great teacher. And there, once again, it should never be technology for technology's sake. It should be in service to some higher order pedagogical aspiration. In my view, personalization, mastery learning, these have always been the gold standard. Every teacher knows they have a classroom of 30 kids. They're all ready to learn at different paces. They all have different gaps. The teacher wishes they could replicate themselves 30 times so that they can individually meet all those kids, but it's just logistically impossible. They wish they could have a 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 or 1-to-5 teacher-student ratio, but we know that that's not economically feasible. But I think now technology is in a position where it can help the teacher, or if a student's operating on their own, get closer to that ideal. And it can do it directly the way, Khan Academy is doing it, giving you as much practice as you need, recommendations, going at your own pace, getting video instruction. It can also act as a connector. The mission statement for schoolhouse.world is connecting the world through learning. So it's, once again, it's unlocking human to human connection. It's not technology somehow turning us into a Vulcan or a Borg reality. It's doing the opposite. It's allowing our humanity to come out connected with more people. Even, the classrooms that are using Khan Academy well, the kids aren't just in front of a computer all the time. They're talking to each other. They're teaching each other. The teacher is able to do more focused interventions with the kids who need help, while some of the other kids are able to continue working at their own time and pace. So there's more interaction, human interaction, than normal. And so that's where I see technology as a real enabler. How do we drive human connection? How do we drive human motivation? And how do we personalize to the needs of individuals?
And also the data, right? The data access and transparency that educators can have is also a huge benefit. So listen, for all the parents out there, right, that have been struggling, you've got 3 kids at home. So would love to learn more about how your family has adapted to at-home learning during this pandemic, and what advice would you lend? Because I got to tell you, if Sal Khan hasn't figured it out, all bets are off.
Well, what are people having trouble with their kids at home? I mean, I find it incredible. No, no. Well, don't you? I mean, my kids are 11, 9, and recently turned 6. And, you know, our situation, I will say the school that my kids go to, which, you know, I shamelessly take, you know, I help start, which is all around personalization and
Full
students. You
exposure.
know, a lot of what Khan Lab School does is a focus on students building agency over themselves. So even at, you know, the kindergartners or the equivalent of the first graders, you know, they set their own goals, they review it with their advisor. It's not a parent teacher conference, it's actually a student conference with the parent and teacher there, where the student reports on their goals and they reflect. And so when it had to virtualize during the spring, the school did a very good job. And the kids had actually already, especially the older kids, my 9 and 11-year-old, the school had already invested a lot in those muscles. So I was actually very impressed. It was a good transition for them. My, at the time, 5-year-old, that was harder. We had
Yeah.
it was a source of tension in the house. You know, and my wife's a physician, and, you know, she was seeing some patients from home. She had to go to the hospital, and I, you know, obviously my job became even more busy. So we were all kind of, and my mother-in-law lives with us, which has been nice, and that's really helped us, especially with our youngest. But it's been hard, and I think what every family's been feeling is, you know, a form of inadequacy that takes different extremes. You either feel inadequate that not enough is happening for your child, or you feel inadequate that too much is happening for your child and you have trouble keeping up with it. And what I remind myself, my wife, you know, all of us, is the last thing that kids need is stressed parents right now. Because if the parents are stressed, and there's all, you know, there's COVID, there's the economy, there's politics, there's a lot going on in the world, and then there's the academic component. If we're stressed, if we're super triggerable, that's just going to increase the stress level for kids. And if you know, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you don't have your mental health in the right place, you're not going to be able to do algebra. You're not going to be able to read, you know, a passage about photosynthesis. So number one thing, parents, is, you know, take care of yourself first. Get to a good place, a grounded place. Part of that, I highly recommend meditation. I've been doing it for years. My catalyst was I was getting claustrophobic on planes, but it served me very well as we went to COVID, so I don't get claustrophobic at home. But the other things I would remind families are, you know, you don't if students are able to get even 20-30 minutes a day of solid math, reading, and writing each, and you know, for older kids a little bit more, for younger kids maybe a little bit less, they're going to do just fine. And so this is an opportunity. You know, math, do 30 minutes a day. It doesn't have to be every day, but try to get there. On Khan Academy, if you or an older sibling or a grandmother can sit next to the student and work with them, you'd be surprised, especially if they're able to work in their zone of proximal development on their learning edge. We have solid research. If kids are able to do personalized learning even 45 minutes a week, a week, they grow 20 or 30% faster. If they can do 20 minutes a day, they could grow 1.5x, 2x of what they would typically do. The reading side, Khan Academy has resources. There's other tools out there that can provide reading comprehension, but it could be as simple as picking a magazine article to read every day and then talking about it at lunch. Same thing on the
Yeah.
writing. Just ask your students once a week, write an opinion about why we should, you know, what we should be having for dinner, or what would you do if you were the Secretary of Education, or should we open, you know, whatever. And then we're going to put it on a blog and share it with our cousins and grandparents. If families do those three things, these core skills are not going to atrophy, and in a lot of cases might accelerate more than they might have otherwise had. Now, this, you know, in the spring, a lot of parents were feeling insecure that not enough was happening for their kids because a lot of school districts just weren't able to get in gear fast enough. Now I'm hearing, and I'm feeling this sometimes, that like too much is happening. You know, they fully transplanted traditional school onto video conference, and you have to sometimes submit things are falling behind. There, I recommend, if you're feeling overwhelmed, it's likely the teachers are feeling overwhelmed, other parents are feeling overwhelmed, have a very open but respectful conversation with the teachers. And I think people are willing to kind of turn down the volume, which I think could be good for everyone.
That's right. I such great advice, right? The last thing we need are kids on Zoom or Google Classrooms for, 5 hours a day. That's like the worst thing that we could
I
be doing
can't
with
do
our.
it. I mean, I turn my video on for things like this, but if I'm just like a meeting, I turn my video off. I go for walks. I tell people I'm doing yoga during this meeting. That's a sign of respect. I'm very focused when I'm doing yoga, but we need that.
We sure do. And I'm glad you raised the social and emotional learning side of this, because I remember you talking about your cousin and working with your little cousin to get her into advanced math, and a core part of that was just building her confidence, right? It had nothing to do with her lack of capability or potential. It's all about that social and emotional learning support of building confidence and support, that matters every time, right? And that's where personalized learning starts.
Yeah, it goes back to, you mentioned Nadia, 12 years old, 2004. She was she was visiting me right after my wedding in Boston, and came out that she needed help. And I offered to tutor her. And when she went back to New Orleans, and I was doing it over the phone and Yahoo Doodle, like you mentioned. And what I saw in the beginning, it was just at age 12, she had these narratives in her mind. I am bad at math. She probably had the narrative, girls aren't good at math. And it was unit conversion of all things, not rocket science, that was keeping her back. And it did take the first 2 weeks or so of me acting, I don't have a psychology degree, but acting as a therapist, trying to deprogram all of this negative narrative that she had going on in her mind. And, now I've seen it in multiple cousins. Even it does seem that by about 9 years old, these narratives start to form in people's heads. And by 12 or 13, they get pretty calcified in people's heads. And it takes more and more work to deprogram that, and to kind of get it back to to make people believe. And some of it is for them to just see those wins. And so even with Nadia, I started to get her to engage, deprogram some of these negative narratives. And then when I started teaching her a few things, some of it was to get caught up, but every now and then I would throw in something that was a little bit ahead of curve. And I would tell her, I was like, you know what, you're not supposed to learn that until ninth grade. And that was the kind of stuff that says, oh, maybe Sal isn't just trying to, superficially improve my self-esteem. I just learned what ninth graders learn, or I just learned what, some algebra. And then she started to have that confidence. And once the confidence hits, then that becomes its own self-fulfilling prophecy. As I've said in multiple, that same Nadia who's put into a remedial math class at 7th grade because of unit conversion, I called up her school. I said, hey, I think Nadia Rahman should be able to retake that placement exam. They said, who are you? I said, I'm her cousin. And they let her. And then she was placed into an advanced math track in 7th grade. And then by that summer, she was taking algebra at University of New Orleans at a college level. And by the next year, she was taking pre-calculus and calculus. So she went from being someone who thought she was horrible at math to someone who is probably the best in her school at math within about a year.
That's so awesome. And David, before you jump in, I just got to ask my fun question. So, okay, true or false? You were the lead singer in a heavy metal band? Is that true?
It depends what you classify as singing, but more true than false.
Yeah, I heard all about malignancy. Just curious, wanted to know if you wanted to, give a few notes to the audience, Sal.
No, well, no, I don't. Now a lot of my teenage angst is gone. I'm a very, I meditate, and I'm much more acoustic now, and I'm much more I'm into the singer-songwriter kind of Brandy Carlisle kind of genre, folk music. That's my thing now.
I love it. Well, thanks. I'm going to turn over to David now.
Phyllis, thank you. Saul, we're going to transition to some member questions. And I'm going to combine a few, including one from member Hardik Bot, who's very curious about your business model. I think some of your original funders were some of the biggest names in technology and venture investing: Bill Gates, John Doerr, Reed Hastings. How do you do all the work that you do as a nonprofit?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. And there's a Harvard Business School case on, there's actually 3 now on Khan Academy. The central question is, should it even be a not-for-profit? Because there's some obvious reasons to be a not-for-profit. We have a social goal, but people always wonder about access to capital, access to talent, et cetera, et cetera. Our view is, obviously my old job, I was an analyst at a hedge fund, which is as for-profit as it gets. But in that job, I was actually kind of be able to be a student of capitalism. And so while Khan Academy was evolving, I saw when owners, shareholders were aligned with the mission or the vision, it really worked out well. But even there, I saw sometimes that, as ownership changes over time, visions can transition a lot. I also saw that there's certain markets where markets functioned quite well, and there's other markets where markets didn't function quite as well. Education and healthcare are ones where they don't function quite as well, where the decision maker, the payer, and the beneficiary is oftentimes different people. Now, that doesn't mean there's a lot of room for for-profits in these spaces, but there's also potentially a lot of room for the non-for-profit sector. Let's just put it that way: governments and NGOs. And also another part for nonprofit is when markets might even work, but they might not lead to outcomes that are consistent with our values. If someone's bleeding on the emergency room steps, you don't want to check their insurance before. You want to cure them first, and then worry later about other things. Same thing. If someone wants to learn, really, should there be any gate on that? And so that was the bet behind. And you could argue that free world-class education for anyone, anywhere, that is the mission statement of the public education system. That's the mission of the Department of Education. But that I think the role of philanthropically funded not-for-profits is to do things that are more nimble than the government to show that it can happen. Now, a solid question that I'm always thinking about is, how far can philanthropy take us? Do we have to create earned revenue streams? Do we tap into government funds, which we historically haven't, but now we're at a pretty substantial scale. So we're constantly looking through this, but we've done, based on a framework from the Robin Hood Foundation in New York around how do you calculate social return on investment, just the work that we do in our classroom district work, based on the effect size of what it's doing for students, it looks like the social return on investment is anywhere from, or the ratio between benefit to cost is anywhere from 500 to 1 to 1,000 to 1. And most good social, obviously in the for-profit world, if you're able to get even a 30% return, it's considered good. But we're talking about a many tens of thousands of percent return. So I hope we can always make a very solid case to the philanthropic world that this is literally, if you look at it in a very analytical way, a super scalable way to drive impact. But we are also looking at pseudo, ways that we can figure out other revenue streams that are aligned with our mission and vision. For example, we're the official practice for the SAT, for the LSAT, and those testing bodies actually pay Khan Academy in order to create that. So that's a win-win-win in our minds. They get a broader group of people being able to take their test. We're able to help people prepare and access their potential, and then obviously the students get a high quality free help.
So you're as a CEO of a nonprofit organization, obviously keeping funding sustained is important. You're teaching, you're running an organization. What's a typical day like for you?
Yeah, well, my ideal day, which is pretty typical, is after I do my morning ritual. I'm very habitual in what I do, but after my morning ritual, I will actually, the first part of my day, let's call it the first 2-3 hours, ideally I want that for my creative time. That's when I try to make videos or research things for making videos, or if I want to write some, have some ideas, big ideas on, hey, what could we do eventually in credentialing, or who do we need to partner with, or what could Khan Academy look like in 5 years? That's when I like to do that, when I'm really fresh. Then the middle part of my day tends to be more operational, working with the leadership of Khan Academy or working with partners to figure out what's going on and how we can just operate better and execute better. And then the end of my day tends to be more of what I'm doing right now, talking, being more external. And sometimes those middle two, sometimes it all gets mixed up. But it's it's fundraising, talking to press, speaking at events, evangelizing what we believe in, things like that.
So we've got a number of questions too, and I think this probably resonates with a number of people on the program that do have children. And one of our members was asking, he has 3 kids, 2 who are adjusting very well to remote learning, 1 who's struggling with it. What advice do you have for parents who are in a similar situation and do have a child that's struggling with remote learning?
Once again, I'm not take anything I have to say with a grain of salt. One piece of advice that I found useful from some family friends who are homeschoolers of even very young kids is, when we were struggling with our 5-year-old in the early few months, what they told us is just stick with it. Have consistency, have guardrails, make sure they do their work at the same time. And at least for our 5-year-old who's now 6, it did kind of work. There have been moments over the last 2-3 months where all of a sudden we see him going on his own, logging in, getting all of his materials, and we're like, wow, he's doing it. So that's one piece of advice I would say. The other one is, just make sure. I suspect, and once again, I'm not a therapist or a psychologist, but I suspect it's the social emotional side that is keeping a lot of kids. A lot of kids are feeling stressed. They're not able to communicate it, or they're just feeling lonely. They're not feeling connected with their friends. So any outlets you can get for children, they seem like different problems. You might have the problem, I'm having trouble getting my 7-year-old or my 6-year-old to submit their assignments. But it might be very much related to they're not seeing their friends. They're not getting enough time to run outside. So what we try to do in as COVID safe a way as possible, have a close circle of friends with similar ages that we can meet with masks on at a park or in a backyard, so that our kids are getting some of that socialization and some of that running outside time. But it's not an easy thing. I mean, there's just a lot of stories right now about kids who are straight A students who are failing classes, and these are older kids, and it's they're getting, whether they're feeling anxious, stressed, depressed, lonely. It's not a good situation, but we just have to do a full court press to figure out how to diffuse that. I think for older kids, once I don't want to become like the proselytizer of meditation, but I will be the proselytizer of meditation. Very powerful for students of all ages. For our lab school, for the high school students, I run the meditation club with them. So I have a bunch of, on a regular basis, a bunch of 16 and 17-year-olds who meditate with me, and it helps them as it helps me.
That kind of transitions into some other questions from our members and guests, which is, there's a national dialogue going on in terms of the value of sending kids back to in-person school versus continuing online or hybrid learning. And so what are your feelings about that? And then there's kind of a related question about balancing the value of delivering online education at a time when kids are just naturally spending so much screen time outside of their educational time.
Yeah, it's clear that this pure distance learning for the great majority of kids is very, very suboptimal. You need to be in an environment where you can socialize, where you can read each other's body language, even kind of fine tune your own body language. There's all sorts of impromptu, serendipitous conversations that happen in the hallways that you're not able to have happen. And obviously there's the whole childcare aspect of it, because kids are at home. Parents aren't able to do what they need to do, or they're feeling stressed, and then the kids feel more stressed. So this is suboptimal. So as soon as it's safe, it would be good to be in person. I'm a big proponent that teachers should be in some of those first tiers of getting the vaccine, so that we can get back to open, because it's kids' mental health as well as their academic performance that's gonna suffer if we don't sooner than later. Distance learning, I think, will always have a place, as we were just talking about. There's opportunities for kids to have access to educational opportunities outside of the four walls of their classroom. That's really powerful. There's digital, whether you call it distance or not, it allows for more personalization. That's really powerful. So I hope we can take pieces of it. And if there's one mega trend that at least is happening now, and actually we're seeing it in higher education, or we're increasingly seeing it in K through 12, is a little bit more of the unbundling of people saying, hey, this piece I can do on distance learning well. I could do that at the local community college. That way, when I get back to my campus, I could do this in person. I think you're going to see a lot more of that happen.
Right. So a question that kind of bridges both in-person and distance learning from member Margaret Mueller, which she recalls when you started Khan Academy, you had the concept that you would be getting your lectures online and then also doing your homework and discussion live with your teacher, that flip model. Is that something you're still a proponent of, and has that at all changed given the distance learning environment we're in now?
Yeah, this notion of a flipped classroom, it's definitely something that became strongly associated with us. Mainly, in 2011, I gave a TED Talk, and in that TED Talk, I talked about how teachers were emailing me saying how, hey, Sal, you gave a reasonably good lesson on photosynthesis or on factoring polynomials. Why should I, the teacher, use valuable class time for that now? I could have my kids do that at their own time and pace. And that way, when they come to class, we can do what used to be homework, because you used to have to do homework by yourself without any support, without any feedback. If you're doing it in the classroom, now you have support from your teacher, from your peers. You can get immediate feedback. So it feels like what used to be at homework happening at school and what used to be schoolwork happening at home, the lectures, seems like a win. I believe, generally speaking, that is true. In fact, that's what humanities courses, seminar-based, Socratic-based humanities courses have always done since, well, really Socrates, 2,400 or 2,600 years ago. That's always been there. But what we've actually been a proponent of, and this is a little bit more nuanced, you can't just call it flipped, but it's really whether you're at home or at school, just do whatever makes sense for you to do. So you might be in a classroom and you're ready to practice some things and you're supported by your teachers or your student and your peers. Awesome, do that. But then there might be a moment where you're having trouble with the concept. It's great if a teacher can do a small group intervention with you and a few other kids who are having trouble with that content. Maybe it's a lecture, maybe it's a little problem solving. It could be good in the classroom. You watch a Khan Academy video there too, and you get unblocked and you're off back. And same thing, when you're at home, you might get some asynchronous instruction, or you can do practice and feedback, and the teacher can monitor you from afar. So I'm a bigger believer in wherever you are, do whatever makes sense, but that classroom time, make that as unlock the human beings as much as potential. Have conversations, leverage the fact that people are in the room as much as possible.
Every industry now, whether it be the commercial real estate industry that's pondering what the future of the office market will be, or the healthcare profession where televisits have become increasingly popular, what structural changes do you see in education that will outlast the pandemic and have just kind of a lasting effect on the business model of delivering teaching?
Well, I think it's going to be, we touched on it with Phyllis, which was, I think we're going to have a move to this competency-based learning where there's going to be ways for you to get credit that higher education, that employers are going to recognize, that are going to be independent of how you got there. And you can have multiple shots at goal. So, right now, if you drop out of high school and you later get a GED, there's a little bit of a stigma associated with it. People say, oh, you must have made some weird decisions when you were in high school. But I imagine, in the future world, hey, you got that whatever certification in algebra or accounting or whatever it is. Google has this really incredible certification program they're doing in IT, in project management, and they're going to do UX design. And they're saying, we don't care how you got it. We don't care if you're 50 or you're 15. If you got the certification, you are interesting for not only a job at Google, but there's 100-something other employers who are looking at that. So I think this move to competency-based learning, both on the kind of, for lack of a better word, vocational side and on the academic side, is going to become more mainstream. Learning not being bound by time or space is going to be more mainstream. I think you have a whole generation of parents who are more invested in their kids' education than ever. The pod schooling and this kind of homeschooling hybrid stuff, a lot of people have been associating it with the upper middle class families in the suburbs, but we're hearing a lot of even lower income families who are taking that very, very seriously because they care just as much as anyone does about making sure that their kids are getting the right services that resonate with them. And they are realizing now that there's certain things that their local public school was doing really well, but then there were certain gaps that their kids weren't getting. And they need to figure out ways to supplement those gaps. So I think that's going to continue. I think there's going to be a lot more emphasis on there's hopefully will be on personalization because we're going to need that frankly, I think we've always needed that. And the problem's just gotten worse during COVID.
Our members have asked, what role AI will play in that personalization model?
Yeah, I always say, once again, never technology for technology's sake. AI is really good at training it on a data set and then based on that, being able to make judgments or recommendations that have an optimal chance of kind of moving someone to some action. So I think AI could be really interesting in terms of motivating students. We might realize that it could just be a little, text or, intervening with students in certain ways at the right time, keep them from disengaging. I actually think disengagement is probably the hardest problem right now. We're seeing that with the general education system. All edtech, most legitimate edtech tools, if kids engage, they actually learn a ton. The question is, how do we get them to engage regularly? So I think AI is going to be really helpful for engagement, for trying to understand where folks are. There could even be some interesting things on the mental health side. But once again, we do very small things on it. We used to do more actually, and we unwound some of that because it was, the data that was being trained on was a little bit strange. So it should never be AI for AI's sake. It should be, what's our goal? Is there a simple way to solve it? Or are there AI ways to solve it where we can train it on large data sets?
Great. Just one last question. Everybody has a Khan Academy story. Even while we were warming up today, everyone shared theirs. I'm sure you hear hundreds or thousands of personal stories how Khan Academy has changed in a kid's life, a parent's life. Are there one or two that resonate with you, that have stuck with you over the years?
Yeah, that's one of the most fun things about what I get to do is, I enjoy the work, but then, and it's good to see the numbers, 10 million or 20 or 30 million using it. But when we get these letters, and even over the weekend, I got a letter from a young girl saying how she was crying while she was writing the letter, how it helped her. But the ones that really stand out, there's probably three. One, I got a video testimonial from a young girl in Mongolia. This was actually early this is probably 2011, 2012. I immediately assumed she's middle class. Her English was quite good. She had access to the internet. Then I read the text of her email that came with it a little bit closer. It turns out there was a group of volunteers from Cisco who were going to Mongolia and setting up computer labs in orphanages. And she was one of the orphan girls in Mongolia. And she was using Khan Academy to actualize herself. And then she became the top contributor to Khan Academy in the Mongolian language. So by unlocking her, we were able to unlock essentially being able to do Khan Academy in her language. Another story, this is actually more recent. I was, one of my friends is a professor at Stanford, teaches a class on entrepreneurship. I was a guest lecturer there. And then, half an hour into it, we say any questions. And in the front row, there was this gentleman who actually didn't look like college age, looked a little bit closer to my age. And I was like, oh yes, what's your question? And then he immediately just breaks down crying. And his name's Jason. And I was like, where's this going to go? I had no idea what's going on. Like a grown man crying in front of me. And he said that when he was 18, he visited his dad in Illinois from California. His mom had an addiction problem, and she actually was helping him sell marijuana. And in Illinois, he sold marijuana. Illinois had much stiffer penalty for marijuana sales. He was sentenced to 30 years in jail for selling marijuana at age 18 in Illinois while he was visiting his father, who he had never met. And while he was in jail, that's actually what sobered up his mother. His mother then starts essentially bringing in, they didn't have any internet access in the prison, transcripts of Khan Academy content to him, and using that, he starts to learn. He gets his sentence commuted down to 15 years. So now he's in his early 30s. He gets out of prison. He starts going to the community college. He's able to access Khan Academy for real. For him, it's like heaven, like to actually be able to not just get it through transcripts, to actually be able to practice. And he's like, I'm good at this. He takes the SAT. He scores in like the high 1500s. He decides he wants to transfer. He decides to transfer to Stanford, and he transfers to Stanford. And as a 34-year-old, he was a junior in that class that my friend was teaching, and that's why he was breaking down crying. That was if you do a Google search for Jason Khan Academy, you can see him tell that story. I'll share one last one. 7-8 years ago, Taliban take over a town in Afghanistan. A young girl by the name of Sultana. They forbade her to go to school, literally threatened her directly with physical violence if she even attempted. So she's at home doing like 10 hours of chores every day. Her brother-in-law sees that she's really curious, gets her a low-cost, simple laptop and an internet connection. She uses that to teach herself English. She reads a Time magazine article about Khan Academy. She's like, this is what I need. It becomes her lifeline. She's, I've since met her, and she said, as soon as I did all my chores at midnight, I just wouldn't sleep. I'd go on Khan Academy for 2-3 hours every night. She says there was a moment when she was around 12 where she realized that she was learning more than her brothers in the Taliban-controlled schools, which isn't like the gold standard of education, but it was a meaningful thing for her. And so she kept going, and she starts learning algebra, physics, chemistry, biology. She decides she wants to become a theoretical physics researcher in the United States. Through the internet, she learns about this thing called the SAT, which is not administered in Afghanistan. She lies to her parents, who are conservative Afghani parents, that she was going to visit some family in Pakistan, but she was really going to Pakistan by herself to take the SAT. And she does unusually well. And that's when I find out about her, because this was about 4 years ago, she was having trouble getting a visa to the United States. One, she didn't have the money for tuition. And also, you can imagine coming from Afghanistan in the climate that we were in at the time was not easy. And then I started emailing people. Luckily, Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times finds out about her, writes an op-ed piece, Meet Sultana, the Taliban's Worst Fear. And you can look that up. Do a Google search for Meet Sultana, the Taliban's Worst Fear. You'll find his article. And because of that, she was able to get political asylum. And the last I checked with Sultana, right now, she is a quantum computing researcher at Tufts University. So these are the types of things that, for every Sultana or Jason or Zaya out there, I think there's millions of more that we have the potential.
Sal Khan, thank you so much for joining us at the Economic Club of Chicago. And Phyllis, thank you so much for leading just a wonderful conversation.